Good evening and welcome back to the fifth meeting of our seminar Percorsi di Teologia Politica, Itineraries of Political Theology, which I organized with my colleagues Giuditta Bissiato, Giulia Longoni, Dino Galli and Paolo Murrone. First of all, I'd like to welcome Professor Nadler to the University of Pisa, where we are attending the PhD in philosophy. Thank you, Professor, for having accepted our invitation to talk about a topic in political theology of Spinoza's thought. As a matter of fact, we couldn't omit Spinoza from our itineraries. Now I'd like to introduce our lecturer. Stephen Nadler is professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is also director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities. In 2020, he was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was also visiting professor in many important universities, the University of Amsterdam, the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, Stanford University, and the University of Chicago. It's important for us to remember that Professor Nadler was scholar in residence at the American Academy in Rome. And in May 2019, he gave 2 lectures to the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa, Spinoza and Menasseh ben Israel, and Facts and Fictions, and Spinoza's Ethics as a Theological Political Treatise. His research interests concern medieval Jewish philosophy, early modern philosophy, and the philosophy in the 17th century. He published very important studies about Descartes and Cartesianism, Leibniz and Spinoza, of course. Many of these were translated in Italian, mostly for Einaudi. In fact, Stephen Nadler is a point of reference in the scholarship about Spinoza, for in 2007, he held the Spinoza Chair at the University of Amsterdam. Among its numerous publications, we should mention Spinoza, A Life, Cambridge, 1999, translated in Italian, Baruch Spinoza e l'Olanda del Seicento, Einaudi, 2002. Spinoza's Heresy, Immortality and the Jewish Mind, Oxford, 2002. Rembrandt's Jews, Chicago, 2003. The Best of All Possible Worlds, A Story of Philosophers, God and Evil, New York, 2008. Spinoza's Ethics, An Introduction, Cambridge, 2006. And The Amazing A Book Forged in Hell, Spinoza's Scandalous Treatise and the Birth of the Secular Age, Princeton, 2011. And this was translated in Italian, Un libro forgiato all'inferno, lo scandaloso trattato di Spinoza e la nascita della secolarizzazione, Einaudi, Torino 2013. Another great book is The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, and the Italian title is very evocative. Eretici, i meravigliosi e pericolosi inizi della filosofia moderna, Carocci 2017. And his last publication is Think List of Death, Spinoza on How to Live and How to Live, Princeton 2020. And it has already been translated in Italian, Spinoza sulla vita e sulla morte, una guida filosofica, Einaudi 2021. He was also co-editor of the Cambridge History of Jewish Philosophy from Antiquity through the 17th century, Cambridge 2009, and of the Oxford Handbook to Descartes and Cartesianism, Oxford 2019. Today, Professor Nadler will give the lecture Spinoza, Jefferson, and the Separation of Church and State. He will deal with a very interesting thesis that we find in the last 5 chapters of the Tractatus Theologico Politicus. The title of the 19th chapter is very representative of this conception. Ius circa sacra, penes summas potestates omnino esse, et religionis cultum externum, rei publice pace accommodari debere. Authority in sacred matters belongs wholly to the sovereign powers, and the external cult of this religion must be consistent with the stability of the state if we wish to obey God rightly. We will see that this position can be compared with Thomas Jefferson's views about the separation of church and state. I would like to conclude by clarifying why I have put the Moses by Michelangelo in the flyer of this lecture. In the Tractatus, Spinoza usually says that Moses is an exception in the history of the Hebrew state, because no one after Moses had the same power that he received by God. For Spinoza wrote in the 17th chapter, he, Moses, gave no one the right to consult God alone whenever he wished, and consequently gave no one the authority he had himself possessed of making and repealing laws, of deciding war and peace, of choosing both temple and state officials. All of these functions belong to one who holds sovereign power. I've quoted the translation of the Cambridge text in the History of Philosophy. So, according to Spinoza, Moses is a virtuous example of sovereign power that rules over all the aspects of a political community, a topic that we have already found in our first itineraries of political theology with Plato, Al-Farabi, Hobbes, and Kant. And now I leave the floor to Professor Nadler. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction and for the invitation to come speak to you today. And actually, I've now been able to make my screen work, so I'll be reading the paper from my own screen. So I'll be scrolling myself, and hopefully everybody can follow along on Giuseppe's screen.
Okay, thank you.
Spinoza has long been heralded as a forerunner of all things modern, and in many respects, rightly so. In the domain of ethics, religion, and politics, we can see how he carries the standard for many values that we recognize as modern, even progressive. He is, after all, the 17th century's most forceful and eloquent proponent of the democratic, tolerant, and secular state. Democracy, Spinoza argues in both the Theological Political Treatise, published to great alarm in 1670, and the Political Treatise, left uncompleted at his death, democracy is the most natural form of government arising out of the social contract and the best form of commonwealth. A democratic governing assembly is most likely to issue laws based on sound reason and to serve the ends for which government is instituted: freedom, security, and culture. This is because in a democracy, the people obey only laws that issue from the general will of the body politic. It is also the form of government least subject to various abuses of power. In a democracy, the rationality of the sovereign assembly's commands is practically secured, as it is unlikely that a majority of a large number of people will agree to an irrational design. Contrary voices answering to irrational individual preferences and passions will cancel each other out, and the resulting decrees will reflect what is in the rational interest of all. Monarchy, on the other hand, is the least stable form of government and the one most likely to degenerate into tyranny. As for toleration, the subtitle of the Theological Political Treatise makes it perfectly clear where Spinoza stands on this issue. He says, wherein it is shown that the Republic can grant freedom of philosophizing without harming its peace or piety, and cannot deny it without destroying its peace and piety. Spinoza is especially concerned to show that the peace, stability, and security of the state can only be undermined when civic affairs are allowed to be directed by ecclesiastics, and when intellectual matters are policed according to their conformity to sectarian religious dogma. In this sense, one can rightly speak of Spinoza's commitment to the separation of church and state. This is the moral of the history of the ancient Israelite kingdoms, in which things began to fall apart when priests took for themselves the right to rule. And it is a lesson that the Dutch Republic should now, in the late 1660s, take to heart, as conservative leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church seek to control what happens not just within their houses of worship, but within the public domain as well. However, things are a little more complicated than they may seem at first glance. Spinoza, in a striking way, does not argue, in fact, for the separation of church and state. However, it is not that he thinks that the state should conform to religious strictures. Rather, he believes that it is the state or civil sovereign that should exercise control over what happens in the religious sphere, especially when church affairs are a matter of public activity. The contours of Spinoza's views on church and state become especially clear when they are compared with the views of Thomas Jefferson, writing a century later. Jefferson on the separation of church and state. The United States Constitution was drafted in 1787 and finally ratified by the states in 1788. It was immediately found wanting, however, especially with regard to the protection of individual rights. Thus, in 1791, the Constitution was supplemented by 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights. The very first of these amendments includes 2 clauses regarding the relationship between the federal government and religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first clause, known as the Establishment Clause, forbids the government from favoring not just any particular religion, but religion in general. The second clause, known as the Free Exercise Clause, forbids the government from interfering with the observance of religious faiths, giving rise, of course, to disputes generated by religious practices that violate other federal laws, such as rituals using hallucinogenic narcotics. Together, these 2 clauses amount, in theory, to a robust separation of church, construed broadly to include any sectarian faith, and state, that is, a separation of the religious and civic domains. Something like the phrase separation of church and state itself seems to have been first used by a public official when Roger Williams, the founder of the colony of Rhode Island, referred to a, quote, wall or hedge of separation between the wilderness of the world and the garden of the church. The most famous use of the phrase, however, appears in Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. According to Jefferson, the point of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment was to build, quote, a wall of separation between the church and the state. Jefferson and his colleague James Madison were especially concerned with preventing government establishment of one particular religion, much as the Anglican faith was established church in Great Britain, or even any religion at all. Here's the relevant part of Jefferson's text. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. As concerned as Jefferson was with religious freedom from government interference, he was equally worried about ecclesiastics interfering in government affairs. He feared a situation in which kings, nobles, and priests form a kind of aristocracy, or worse, theocracy, whereby they set themselves up as good conservators of the public happiness, when in fact they are generally ignorant of and even opposed to the public happiness. Spinoza on Church and State. Jefferson owned several volumes by Spinoza. In his library there was a copy of the first edition of the Tractatus Theologica Politicus, a copy of that treatise in English translation from 1689, and a first edition of the Opera Postuma, which contained the ethics and the correspondence, among other things. We do not know whether and how much of these works Jefferson actually read. There are no marginalia in any of the volumes. Still, much of what Jefferson has to say about the relationship between church and state echoes Spinoza's solution to the theological political problem. At the same time, there are significant and illuminating differences. Spinoza, contrary to the charges made by his contemporary critics, was not an irreligious person, at least not when religion is properly understood. On one occasion, when he was accused of having renounced all religion, Spinoza replied, "Does that man pray and renounce all religion who declares that God must be acknowledged as the highest good, and that he must be loved as such in a free spirit, and that in this alone does our supreme happiness and our highest freedom consist?" There is a crucial distinction, Spinoza argued in the Theological Political Treatise, between organized sectarian religions and what he calls true religion. There are sectarian cults united by dogma, bound by specific rites and ceremonies, and governed by authoritative hierarchies. And then there is true piety, which consists only in the love of God and of one's fellow human beings, and the moral or ethical behavior to which such love gives rise. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are, naturally, Spinoza's paradigmatic sectarian religions. As Abrahamic traditions, they obviously share common patriarchal origins. But what distinguishes them from one another and provides their exclusivity is the fact that they recognize different individuals as the supreme prophet, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, and different texts as canonical, and they demand different beliefs and rituals of their adherents. Spinoza is certain, however, that none of this matters when it comes to true religion. For example, the ceremonial laws of Moses, Spinoza concludes, contribute nothing to blessedness, but have to do only with the political and economic well-being of the ancient Israelite commonwealth. The observance of ceremonies, he says, has regard only to the temporal prosperity of the state and in no way contributes to blessedness. Scripture promises for ceremonial observance nothing but material advantages and pleasures, while blessedness is promised only for observance of the universal divine law. Similar considerations apply to the ceremonies of Christianity, such as baptism, prayers, the sacraments, and the celebration of holy days. He says, if these ceremonies were ever instituted by Christ or the apostles, of which I am not yet convinced, they were instituted only as external symbols of a universal church, not as conducing to blessedness or as containing an intrinsic holiness. Therefore, although it was not to support a sovereign state that these ceremonies were instituted, yet their only purpose was the unification of a particular society, and thus he who lives in solitude is by no means bound by them. Spinoza's point is that the dogmas and rituals of Judaism and Christianity, and Islam for that matter, are neither necessary nor sufficient for the achievement of the highest human good and salvation, the real goals of religion. The rituals are not sufficient because one may know and follow every single one of the Torah's commandments and still have nothing of true religion. And one can be a rigorously observant and ceremonially devout Christian and still not enjoy true piety. The rituals, on the other hand, are not necessary because one can be a paragon of true religious devotion and know or care nothing at all for Jewish law or Christian rites. He who, while unacquainted with the writings of Scripture, nevertheless knows by the natural light that there is a God having the attributes of wisdom and righteousness, and who also pursues a true way of life, is altogether blessed, indeed more blessed than the multitude. The core of true religion for Spinoza is obedience not to man-made ceremonial laws, but to divine law. While human law is meant to prescribe what one should do to safeguard life and the commonwealth, to protect oneself and one's property from others, and ensure the well-being of the state, divine law prescribes what one should do to obtain the supreme good, that is, what is most to one's advantage, not as a physical, social, or political being, but as a rational and moral being. And what the divine law commands is, at least in the face of it, quite simple: to know and love God and to love one's neighbor as oneself, and to treat other human beings with justice and charity. Piety in the practice of religion, he claims, consists only in works, that is, only in the practice of loving kindness and justice. As we shall see, another important distinction for Spinoza concerns a tripartite distinction between interfaith, private worship, including private communal worship, and public activities in the service of one's religious institution, including such things as large worship gatherings, the celebration of holidays and life cycle events, such as births, weddings, or funerals, religious speeches, and publications. The first, private worship, interfaith, may not, and in fact probably cannot, be regulated by the political sovereign. The second, private worship, may, however, be regulated by the political sovereign, since it is a matter of action and not just belief. And the third set, public activities, certainly does fall in the sovereign's realm of responsibility and must be regulated by the political sovereign, although it is up to the sovereign to decide how strictly to do so. 200 years before the framing of the United States Constitution, freedom of religion was enshrined among the founding tenets of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht states that every individual should remain free in his religion, and no man should be molested or questioned on the subject of divine worship. The leaders of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century may not always have been faithful to this principle, and they certainly did not believe that in the separation of church and state in the Netherlands, where the Reformed Church was, if not the established church, at least a formally privileged one. Still, there was for the period an unusually high freedom of religion in Holland and the other provinces, if not freedom from religion, since perceived atheists were, as Spinoza learned, sometimes persecuted with vehemence. It was precisely the threats to this and other freedoms in the Republic that had Spinoza sufficiently worried that he felt he had to write something about it. As the author of a theological political work, and having prepared the ground in the chapters where he discusses the Bible, miracles, prophecy, faith, scripture, and political theory, Spinoza finally turns in the theological political treatise to what he views as the proper relationship between the state and religion. Now, it is often asserted that Spinoza was a strong early proponent of the separation of church and state, and that he, along with John Locke, laid the foundation for later programs of complete religious toleration. One commentator even writes that, quote, "the spirit of Spinoza lives on in the opening words of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the phrase referred to as the Establishment Clause." In fact, this is not right at all. The separation of church and state can mean a number of things. Spinoza did believe that when it comes to religious belief, people should be left alone to believe or not believe whatever they want. As he notes, because the nature of religion consists not so much in external actions as in simplicity and honesty of heart, it is not the domain of any public legislation or public authority. For simplicity and honesty of heart are not instilled in men by the command of laws or by public authority. Absolutely no one can be compelled by force or by laws to become blessed. Therefore, since each person has the supreme right to think freely, even about religion, each person will also have the supreme right and the supreme authority to judge freely concerning religion, and hence to explain it and interpret it for himself. It is impossible to control people's beliefs anyway. There's no way to monitor what goes on in their minds, and any attempt by the government to reach into their minds, regulate their beliefs, is doomed to fail, is doomed to backfire and generate resentment, hypocrisy, with people thinking one thing and saying another, and perhaps even rebellion. True piety, the inward worship of God, is an entirely personal matter. It may be encouraged, but should, as a matter not only of necessity but of right, be left to the individual alone. Spinoza argues as well that the free expression of one's religious beliefs, verbally or in writing, should also be tolerated by the state, but only up to a degree. In general, no one should be prosecuted for heresy or irreligion, or indeed for propounding any philosophical or theological views. The attempt to suppress what people say, like the attempt to regulate what they believe, can only harm the state it is allegedly intended to protect. It too will lead to resentment, secrecy, and ultimately revolt. However, Spinoza is not an absolutist when it comes to freedom of speech and expression. The state should not allow anyone to say anything they want anywhere, at any time, and under any circumstances. He does allow the sovereign the right to punish those whose speech is likely to give rise to seditious activity. This applies not only to explicitly political speech, but also to the public expression in certain circumstances of ideas that the civil sovereign deems to be irreligious, and thus inimical to the practice of justice and charity. Which brings me to my main point. For if the separation of church and state means what it is usually taken to mean in the free exercise and establishment clauses of the U.S. Constitution, that it is not up to the government to decide what counts as religion, and that the government may not regulate or formally endorse or suppress the expression of religious opinions or any particular set of religious practices or outward forms of worship, if that's what separation of church and state means, then here Spinoza parts company with Jefferson and his fellow founders of the American Republic. In the properly ordered state, Spinoza argues, the sovereign power, the summa potestas, is charged with all matters of public well-being. Any actions or practices that enter into the public domain and therefore may possibly affect the welfare of the people and the commonwealth, all these are the responsibility of the government. The state's laws and decrees must be directed toward the peace, security, and stability of the polity, and its legislators must take care to regulate institutions whose activities have some bearing on these. By contrast, anything that is not related to the public good, such as private belief, is not within the sovereign's purview. It follows, then, that the sovereign's authority extends not only to the promulgation of civil laws, but to laying down religious laws as well, at least insofar as these are related to piety in the form of public activities. The inner worship of God and the feelings of love towards one's neighbors are to be left to the individual, though such beliefs and values certainly can and should be encouraged by the civil authority, since these mental states are not without effect on public behavior. But the outer form in which the worship of God and neighborly love are to be expressed and practiced, that is, the rites and ceremonies observed, and especially the expression of the love of and obedience to God and the love of one's neighbor through justice and charity in action, all of this falls within the public domain and thus within the sovereign's sphere of authority. This means that the sovereign is responsible for what Spinoza calls the interpretation of religion. As Spinoza puts it in chapter 19 of the treatise, religious worship and the exercise of piety must be accommodated to the peace and utility of the Republic, and hence must be determined only by the supreme powers, who must also be its interpreters. A few passages later, he notes that, since it is the duty of the supreme power alone to determine what is necessary for the well-being of the whole people and the security of the state, and to command what it has judged to be necessary, it follows that it is the duty of the supreme power alone to determine in what way each person must devote himself to his neighbor in accordance with piety, in what way each person is bound to obey God. He reminds the reader that this governmental oversight applies only to the external practice of religion, not piety itself and the internal worship of God. On such internal matters, each person is his own master. Individual citizens are, of course, free to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, and to take to heart, however they can, and with whatever metaphysical, theological, and historical beliefs may help them, its exhortations to justice and charity. But whether in a democratic or an aristocratic form of government, the governing assembly is to decide how God's law, to love one's neighbor and exercise justice and charity, is to be translated into practice, since the government alone has sole authority to decide what activities are consistent with the public welfare. He says no one can exercise piety toward his neighbor in accordance with God's command unless his piety and religion conform to the public good. But no private citizen can know what is good for the state except from the decrees of the supreme power, to whom alone it belongs to transact public business. Therefore, no one can practice piety aright nor obey God unless he obeys the decrees of the supreme power in all things. For the same reason, the civil sovereign is also the source of the normative force of God's decrees in the state. Since God is, in philosophical truth, not an anthropomorphic ruler or providential lawgiver, there are no laws, divine or otherwise, in a state of nature. Before the formal institution of a polity, there is neither justice nor injustice, no piety and no sin. And there are no valid laws in the commonwealth that are not enacted by the sovereign, including all laws regarding the exercise of justice and charity, that is, the practice of true religion. Since, Spinoza says, justice and charity can acquire the force of law and command only through the right of the state, I can readily draw the conclusion, since the state's right is vested in the supreme power alone, that religion can acquire the force of law only from the decree of those who have the right to command, and that God has no special kingdom over men save through the medium of those who hold supreme power. Notice that Spinoza says that the organization and control of religion is the duty of the sovereign alone. Among those private citizens who are not qualified to make judgments about the public good and thus dictate outward forms of worship, including presumably ceremonial rites, are sectarian clergy. Spinoza has fully removed the supervision of religion from sectarian leaders and put it firmly in the hands of the civil authority. The sovereign is free to appoint ecclesiastics to act as its ministers in religious affairs, but these representatives serve at the pleasure of and fully answer to the secular authority. Civil control of religious affairs, while no doubt offensive to early modern ecclesiastics, was in fact a prominent theme in 17th century Dutch Republican thought, and Spinoza was not alone in his views on this matter. Hugo Grotius, in his work De Imperio Summarium Potestatem Circa Sacra, had proposed political regulation of preaching and worship, while Peter de la Corte, foreshadowing Spinoza, insisted in his political discourses that the state, insofar as it is responsible for peace, security, and prosperity, should have power over all religious activities, while at the same time tolerating a diversity of religious beliefs. Meanwhile, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, too, argued, not surprisingly, that the sovereign is to have absolute command over religion within its dominion, not just the organization and content of public preaching, but even in determining what is Scripture and what is the Word of God. Hobbes says, "There is no other government in this life, neither a state nor religion, but temporal, nor teaching of any doctrine, lawful to any subject, which the governor, both of the state and of the religion, forbiddeth to be taught. And that governor must be one, that is unique, or else there must needs follow faction and civil war in the commonwealth." There may be many pastors in a state, Hobbes says, but they must all be subordinate to a single chief pastor. And who that chief pastor is, according to the law of nature, hath already been shown, namely that it is the civil sovereign. The alternative to this consolidation of the right politic and ecclesiastic is, Hobbes believes, civil troubles, divisions, and calamities for the nation. For Spinoza, then, any public forms of religious devotion are to be regulated and supervised by the civil government. And there may indeed be many different organized forms of public devotion and activity in the state and subjected to official scrutiny. All the different ways in which sectarian religions prescribe how their devotees are to gather for worship, celebrate religious occasions, perform baptism, marriages, funerals, etc. Spinoza's intention is most definitely not to institute a single state religion with compulsory church attendance and religious observance and a unique set of ceremonies. And he especially does not want the sovereign to dictate compulsory religious dogma, although it is the sovereign's responsibility to encourage among the masses an acceptance of those basic tenets of faith that are necessary for obedience to God's law. No one is to be forced to believe or to worship anything, to join any gathering, or to engage in any ceremonial practices. Such enforced, and therefore false piety and mandated conformity would not be consistent with the primary aim of the state or of Spinoza's project, that is, increasing the rationality and freedom of its citizens and ensuring civic peace. Spinoza is not interested in seeing totalitarian control over people's lives. Rather, his position is based on the fear that without such singular, centralized, and secular control over religious matters, there's a real danger to the well-being of the commonwealth. As he says in the political treatise, while each citizen may be a master of his own thoughts, he has no right to decide what is fair or unfair, pious or impious. This belongs exclusively to the commonwealth. In Spinoza's view, The greatest threat to civil peace, both in theory and in practice, as ancient, biblical, and contemporary Dutch events have shown, the greatest threat to civil peace are the divisions introduced into society by sectarian religions. The multiplication of sects distinct from the official public religion, what in the political treatise Spinoza calls the national religion and a simple and most universal religion, are a potential danger to the security and stability of even a prosperous society. Sectarian religions can set citizens against each other. Christians against Jews, Protestants against Catholics, Protestants against other Protestants, as the Dutch Republic itself was being torn apart by vicious divisions within the Dutch Reformed Church throughout most of the 17th century. More importantly, sectarian religions can set citizens against the state itself. As soon as there are alternative sources of authority besides the civil sovereign, the loyalty of citizens is divided. It becomes a legitimate question as to whether the citizens are devoted to the polity at large and the general welfare, or to their narrow sectarian causes. And a commonwealth within which there is such a schism of loyalties, with piety opposed to patriotism, cannot last long. It will eventually disintegrate under the pressure of civil discord. As Hobbes succinctly put it, no man can serve two masters. The problem becomes particularly acute when the religious functionaries themselves seek influence over not just the hearts and minds of their congregants, but the social and moral life of the polity. It is in fact inevitable that ecclesiastics, once allowed their independent sectarian domains, will encroach upon the civil power and strive for supremacy over it. The result of such a usurpation of political authority is a division of sovereignty in the Commonwealth, and in the end, its downfall. This is precisely the lesson that Spinoza finds in ancient Israelite history. As long as political and religious authority were combined in one man, such as Moses, or one body acting on behalf of God, the true sovereign, the Hebrew Commonwealth thrived as a theocracy. There was no confusion over to whom obedience was owed. A priestly caste existed, but its members were completely subordinate to the sovereign. They were consultants on religious matters, not leaders. After the monarchy was instituted under Saul, however, things deteriorated as power in the kingdom devolved into political and religious spheres. The kings were forced to recognize the dominion within their dominion as the priests exercised greater influence within and subsequently beyond the confines of the sanctuary. This was the beginning of the end. Anyone who seeks to deprive the sovereign of this authority over religion is attempting to divide the sovereignty, and a result, as happened long ago in the case of the kings and priests of the Hebrews, there will inevitably arise strife and dissensions that can never be allayed. With the return from exile in Babylon and the restoration of independence in the Second Temple period, the priests usurped the right of government, thereby holding absolute power. In a reading of biblical history that has clear resonance for the contemporary scene, where in the late 1660s the Orthodox Calvinist elements in Dutch society exerted their considerable influence on behalf of the Orangist bloc and the return of the stadtholder, and thus opposed the domestic and foreign policies of De Witt and the States Party. In this contemporary Dutch scene, Spinoza notes that the priests became inflamed with desire to combine secular and religious rule, with ruinous consequences for the Israelite Commonwealth. The Dutch Republic, heeding the lesson of the Kingdom of Judah, should not allow ecclesiastics to influence civic affairs. How disastrous it is for both religion and state to grant religious functionaries any right to issue decrees or concern themselves with state business. Stability is far better assured if these officials are restricted to giving answers only when requested, and at other times to teaching and practicing only what is acknowledged as customary and traditional. When priests and preachers acquire the authority to issue decrees and to transact government business, their individual ambitions will know no bounds, and they will each seek self-glorification both in religious and secular matters. They will fall out among themselves, increasing sectarian divisions in society. Corruption will necessarily follow, as the affairs of state will be run according to the self-interest of whichever sect happens to gain the reins of power. Meanwhile, the religion they enforce, now put to service for the perpetuation of their rule, will degenerate into pernicious superstition. This is not without bearing on my main theme today. According to Spinoza, it is not just ecclesiastics should not be allowed to encroach upon the legislation of civil matters. Jefferson, of course, agrees with that. Allowing religious officials to have a hand in crafting civil legislation would be a clear violation of what is implied by the Constitution's Establishment Clause. But, as we have seen, even matters regarding sacred law are the prerogative of the civil sovereign. To allow ecclesiastics to regulate such matters divides sovereignty. The civil sovereign alone is to decree about sacred matters. Indeed, Spinoza insists, all arguments for the separation of sacred right and civil right are frivolous. What are the particular kinds of regulations on religious practices and activities that Spinoza envisions? Between the Theological Political Treatise, 1670, and the Political Treatise, which was left incomplete when Spinoza died in 1677, we can come up with a list that includes things like the following, whether they apply to the national religion or one of the sectarian ones. So it includes, for example, the appointment of ministers, the size of meetings, the reception of people into a sectarian religious community, the excommunication of members, and providing for the poor. Even the size of houses of worship are subject to civil oversight. He says those who are attached to another religion besides a national religion must certainly be allowed to build as many houses of worship as they wish, but these should be small, of some definite size, and at some distance from one another. It's very important that the temples dedicated to the national religion be large and magnificent. And within the national religion, only its patricians, governors, should be permitted to baptize, to consecrate a matter, lay on hands, and unconditionally be recognized as priests and as defenders and interpreters of the national religion. This discussion of the national religion reveals as well that Spinoza not only departs from the broad toleration enshrined in the U.S. Constitution's Free Expression Clause, but also its Establishment Clause. Of course, as with all things Spinoza, things may be more complicated than I have presented them here today. This is only a beginning of trying to disentangle Spinoza's remarks on piety, religious belief, religious action, and civil liberties. Some of the things he says in various contexts appear inconsistent with my presentation so far. Moreover, the relationship with Jefferson's views is unclear. The U.S. Constitution may not allow the government to single out religious activities for legislation, but it can certainly address religious practices that it deems dangerous or a threat to civil peace, and are thus illegal because they violate neutral law. But I will leave these problems for another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And personally, I've learned a lot from your presentation, and I think that you have shown the complexity of such important theme, such as the separation of church and state. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, and we are honored to have you here. And thank you for accepting our invitation again.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's always nice to be in Italy.
Yes. Yes. And we wait for you dal vivo in presenza, and thank you to all the participants for having fed this little debate, and see you on November 29 with a meeting about Simone Weil and Edith Stein. Thank you, and see you.
Goodbye. Thanks very much.
Bye.